my name is Lindsay Wild, and I am a front-end developer at Sparkbox in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So a few months ago, I wrote an article called How and Why We Unit Test Our Sass, and it turns out it was a pretty hot topic, so I decided to make it into a full-length presentation. And this is just a little snippet of my full-length presentation. That way you can kind of get an idea of what I'm going to talk about. So in this snippet, I'm going to talk about why and when to unit test your Sass. So why would you want to unit test your Sass? So it will help you alleviate some of that manual UI regression testing. It's not going to alleviate all of it because you should still be looking at your UI when you push code. However, it can help automate some of it. You can also ensure that the output from certain mixins and functions, especially the ones with complicated logic, that their output is as expected. And that's especially important when you're using third-party libraries, and those mixins that you're getting from them have a lot of complex logic. Also, Sass itself as a library could change in the future, and hopefully they don't change the way that they have their functions and mixins work, but if they were to, then having Sass unit testing around those would be able to help catch that. Another important example is it will help you double check important updates, such as if you're changing the main color of something. So that could definitely impact your project in a huge way if you're changing the main brand color or main color of anything in your project. So having unit tests in place kind of help you to double check that that's actually a change that you want to make. Another reason is that your CSS could still compile fine without any Sass errors. So even though your CSS compiles okay, that doesn't mean that all of the changes that you've made are the ones that you expect to make or that it's giving you the output that you actually want. And the last reason is you can ship less errors. So you can catch a lot of things that break before you actually ship any of your code, which is really great. So unit testing Sass isn't for every project, so I'm going to go through some reasons that when and when not you would actually want to unit test your Sass. So one of the times you would want to unit test your Sass is if you're working on a large project that contains numerous Sass files and partials. So for example, I work on a 6-brand design system and that has over 38 Sass partials. And that's a perfect project for Sass unit testing because if you're moving anything between files or if you make a change and you're not really sure what it all affects, then Sass unit tests can help catch some of those errors. Another time when you would want to unit test your Sass is if a component that you're working on exists in multiple different places and can have multiple different contexts. So for example, if you have a button that always needs to remain the same, but it's on multiple different pages because your website has thousands of pages, that would be a perfect thing to unit test. Another time you would want to unit test your Sass is if your project includes some kind of third-party library that you are using their Sass functions or mixins, especially if those contain any kind of calculations or logic that if it changes, it could totally break your stuff. Then you'd want to write unit tests around the output of those Sass mixins and functions. Another time is if you have complex Sass functions or mixins that you've written yourself. So if those outputs are very important to your project, if those mixins or functions, then you want to test those for sure. And then another time is if the styles are very important and if they were to change, it would break the UI. So in the previous slide, I talked about changing a main color of something. So that would be something that would definitely dramatically change the UI. So that's something you could write unit tests around. And then another reason is if your project supports multiple users or what we refer to as subscribers. So you don't want to break stuff for them, and I'm sure they don't want to receive broken code or they're going to stop using your stuff. So if it supports multiple users, then having unit tests around your code is great. Now, as I mentioned, unit testing isn't for every project, or at least Sass unit testing. So a few reasons why you would not, or when you would not want to unit test your Sass. If you have a small project that doesn't have very much CSS, such as a landing page or like a small marketing site, then you probably don't need to unit test your Sass. It would be a little bit of overkill. In addition to that, something like a static content website. So if you're not going to be making a lot of updates to it, and once you ship it, it's good for a while, then you probably don't need to unit test your Sass. If your project doesn't heavily rely on a consistent UI, so this one's a little bit weird, but if something were to break, like a color were to change or something in your UI and it's not going to affect a lot of people, then you probably don't need to unit test your Sass. And also, if you don't use any Sass mixins or functions, then there's really no reason to do it. So I'll give you a real life example of when we did not have unit tests set up and where they would have saved us. So if you write CSS at all, I'm sure you're familiar with the cascade and how if you rearrange styles, then that can affect the way that the styles are applied. So the last style in order is the one that's applied. So what we did was we were reorganizing our file structure because we realized that we had a lot of subscribers and a lot of them were asking us to provide them with the Sass that they could use. So we wanted to make sure it was pretty cleaned up and organized so that when they get in there, they're not like, what is this mess? We actually shipped a release and we had some button styles in there that we had moved, and one of the buttons appeared to be broken. And it was one of the buttons that wasn't used very heavily. So one of our subscribers actually pointed out to us and they said, hey, this button doesn't look right. It took a few developers a couple hours to figure out what exactly broke and why it broke. So after that, it's kind of what prompted this discussion was, well, how do we prevent that from happening in the future? It affected subscribers. We had to release a new patch, which took a couple of hours to do. So Sass unit testing came out of that, and we actually wrote some unit tests around the button styles so that we checked now that every button or each instance of the button always looks the way that it's supposed to, or the rules that it's supposed to have are always applied. So that's a real life example of when we could have unit tested our Sass and it could have caught some errors for us. So thanks, and feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or send me an email or get in contact with me some way and we can talk about this further.